Hi everyone, my name is Max Kapur and I double major in jazz piano and East Asian language and culture here at USC. And my project is called 4 Glimpses of Han in Lisa Lee's fiction. So what's Han, right? This is a word that connotes a deep kind of suffering that's both personal and collective, and it's a very important part of Korean national identity that's often paired with the word tongue, as we heard about from Juhyun earlier. For now, I want to offer you one translation of Han using a word which comes from Lisa Lee's writing. This word is melancholy, which is a plaintive and sort of ambivalent kind of sadness. This translation is really not perfect at all, but I'm going to have more on that later. And in this presentation, I want to start by unpacking this title in reverse order, starting with a little bit about Lisa Lee and her writing. So I first read Lisa Lee's writing in the library. I'd originally pitched a totally different project for this fellowship, but I was having trouble finding sources, so I just pulled a short story anthology off the shelf, and I flipped it open to Lisa Lee's story, Paradise Cove, and it was amazing. I thought it was just very tender, but also unsettling at the same time. And when I looked her up and found out that she was a PhD student here at USC, I knew I had to do my project on her. Lee's background is in music and in law, but she's currently doing her dissertation in creative writing, and her academic interest is on Han. So I asked Lee what made her turn to writing after having a background in such different fields. And what she told me is, I write because I can't keep my mouth shut, or I'd rather not keep my mouth shut. In her writing, Lee addresses some of the unique challenges that she's experienced as a Korean American woman. And although Lee writes fiction, I think that her stories articulate a very powerful scholarly defense of the importance of Han in Korean American culture. Han is very controversial, to say the least, and I'll have more on that. But its elusive nature means that I think it's almost best described or dealt with through creative writing rather than explanatory writings and essays. So why is Lisa Lee significant, right? Although she's not well known, I think she will be. And her writing matters because it pairs skillful craft and a high degree of creativity with academic rigor. Lee is also one of the only Korean American authors who's dealing with this subject, Han, through fiction, which is kind of surprising given that in Han's studies in Korea, fiction and poetry are so important to our understanding of it. There are a couple of important exceptions to this point. First would be Suji Kwak Kim, who wrote this collection of poems called Notes from the Divided Country. This deals with inherited memories of the Korean War and the colonial period. There's also Linda Sue Park's children's novel, When My Name Was Keiko. This is about the late colonial period from the perspective of a young girl. And then there's Chang Rae-lee's novel, A Gesture Life, which is about a Korean man who passes as a Japanese soldier during World War II. I'm curious, has anyone read any of these? Which one?
The second, Kyoko.
Oh yeah, isn't that great? That's a good one. I'd be happy to talk about those after if anyone would like. So as much as there are a few Korean American novelists dealing with this topic, I also think there are just few well-known, well-studied Korean American novelists in general. And part of this is because Chang Rae-lee kind of takes up a lot of space in the canon. He's occupied scholars' attention because, like Lisa Lee, he has this blend of academic rigor and creative skill. And he's written a lot of really good books. But maybe it's time to let some new voices join the chorus. My secondary subject is Han, which is a sort of emotional concept that is considered uniquely Korean. Translations have been proposed like anguish, resentment, and I mentioned melancholy. But most scholars agree that this word has no real English equivalent. It refers to a very deep sense of injustice. Professor Young-Min Choi at this university calls it the trapped feeling of being unable to process trauma. Han can be intimately personal in that way, but it can also be collective. And given Korea's history of oppression at the hands of foreign and sometimes domestic powers, I think Han can be a form of solidarity that collectivizes and cements Korean national identity. Han is controversial, especially among academics. There are 4 kind of broad views, and all of them have different problems, but I want to kind of summarize them for you. So the first view is kind of the strongest view, which is that Han is like a material, genetic phenomenon that's in the blood of all Koreans, whether they acknowledge it or not. Another kind of formulation of this view is that Han is like a medical condition, that it's contagious or transmitted between generations. A little softer view is that Han is a real phenomenon, but one that's immaterial and that has a mixture of psychological and social causes. In other words, it's kind of an emotion like Chang. Third view is the one I'm partial to, which is that Han is really just a discursive construct that whose meaning is shaped by consensus and context. And fourth, of course, there are some that think Han is just a meaningless, kind of lofty academic term that has no practical significance. For these reasons and more, Han is especially controversial among Korean Americans. There are some who reject Han entirely, or others who believe that it kind of belongs to an older generation of Koreans, or to Koreans in Korea, whereas the history of Korean Americans is unique. So to give you a little bit of a wider window into the controversy surrounding Han, I want to discuss some of the different fields that it's popped up in and the different applications that it's had. So here you can see the Chinese character for Han, which is interesting because in Chinese it actually means hate. And in what I'm calling Korean psychoanalysis, for lack of a better term, there's this concept called 정한, which pairs the characters for love and hate. For a lot of Chinese speakers, and I'm curious if anyone can confirm this kind of looks like nonsense, but in Korean psychoanalysis, this is forms a very important pair with this idea of 원한. So 정한 is when Chang, or love, overtakes Han, and you kind of feign kindness and act loving, even though you have this resentment deep down. And then the opposite end is 원한, which refers to these explosions of anger. But both of these things stem from the same Han at their core. So Han also appears in studies of Korean shamanism. It's considered kind of the source of power for Wudang, or these traditional female shamans. But then we also find Han in Minjung Christian theology, sometimes called Korean liberation theology, where there's kind of this idea that Han collectivizes sin. So what's interesting about this, and to kind of tie all this together, some people have put Han to incredibly practical ends, using it as the basis for psychological practice or Christian ministry. This is especially those who are in that first category, who see Han as like a genetic or physical phenomenon. But there are others who see Han as just like an overgrown literary theory that really only applies to a few texts and certainly not to daily life. I think it's in light of those critics that Lisa Lee's defense of Han is especially provocative and intriguing. So what's clear from all this is that Han is very elusive and hard to define. And I think that also makes it highly adaptable. It's this kind of potential energy that can be put to various ends, which leads me to my target question, which is, to what end does Lisa Lee put Han to, or how does Han manifest in Lisa Lee's fiction? My methodology consists of what's highlighted in red here. So I'm reading the text inductively, which means that I'm trying to make internal connections and let the text kind of speak on its own terms, rather than imposing an external theoretical framework. That's why I use the term glimpsing rather than something more heavy-handed like analyzing. That said, my reading is a little bit deductive because I use some of the language that Han theorists have devised in order to organize my observations and to put them in dialogue with the other ideas of Han scholars. I think because Lisa Lee is herself a Han scholar, this is a kind of a fair move. I'm appraising, by which I just mean assessing the significance of the text in functionalist terms, which means that rather than treating it like a self-contained or hermetically sealed kind of structure, I'm interested in how the text interacts with its writer, its readers, and the world. So to that end, I'm defining the idea of text broadly here. So it includes the stories, but it also includes my correspondence with Lee, an interview we had, and some ancillary writing that she's done about her creative process. It's kind of this functional angle where I hope that my paper can challenge some of the structuralist paradigm in literary criticism. Having access to Lisa Lee as she develops her writing and revises the stories for her final novel has granted me insight into Lee's creative process, an insight into Han that's outside the kind of narrow field of view of a structuralist analysis. This methodology, I think, lends itself especially well to studying something as culturally specific, as contentious, and as subjective as Han. I have a couple of examples of other texts that inspired this methodology, but I'll save those for the questions if you don't mind. So the literary focus of this project is on these three stories, Paradise Cove, The Hunt, and Margaret Cho's Mother. And I've arranged them here in narrative order, which differs from the order they were published, because they're all parts of the same novel in progress. These stories are about Jane Kim, who's a Korean American woman, and her dysfunctional family. And the main drama of the novel is actually not revealed until Margaret Cho's mother, but it's that Jane's older brother, Kevin, has gone missing and they need to find him. And along the way, we learn about Jane's childhood and the many kind of fraught relationships that have shaped her identity. So rather than just kind of summarize all the plots, I want to just use this family tree to illustrate some important conflicts in the story. First, we have Kevin, who's Jane's older brother. He's a police officer with a hot temper, and Paradise Cove ends in a violent confrontation between these two. There's also Kevin's wife, Sang-hee, who has this very bitter rivalry with Jane. She's always criticizing her for not having a doctor husband and for not wearing expensive clothes, which is funny on its own, but it also duplicates this sister-in-law rivalry between Jane's aunt and Jane's mother, who are always trying to instigate rumors about the other. And one of these rumors is strongly implied to be true, which is that Jane's mother is having an affair with a real estate agent named Stan Kwan. So in short, in so many broken relationships, there's kind of a great amount of enmity, or han, that can fester. I don't want to actually dwell too much on my findings because they're kind of closely wed to the text. And what I really want to emphasize is that these bullets I'm about to give don't constitute a definition of Han. Instead, they're glimpses of how Han is active within the stories. So Han appears first as an organizing framework for Jane's emotional chaos. Jane kind of oscillates between these angry outbursts and moments of really impressive self-restraint. And I think we can make sense of these in Han's documented polarities. Another manifestation of Han is that Jane sometimes dissociates, which means kind of loses her sense of self. And she substitutes the desires of Kevin, her brother, for those of her own. But as the stories go on, Han emerges as this kind of powerful medium that connects Jane's trauma to that her family has experienced. So although Jane resents her mother, she comes to pity her when she realizes their shared heritage of suffering. As Jane rejoins the search for Kevin, Jane actually turns Han into a kind of motivational energy that helps her overcome the brokenness and abuse of their relationship. So ultimately, I think Lee is suggesting that Han can have a positive value for Korean Americans. Korean Americans have undergone, to be sure, different kinds of suffering than Koreans in their history, but racism and economic hardship rather than authoritarianism and colonization, for example. But Han can build transnational Korean solidarity in the face of such diverse traumas. And so I think understanding and mobilizing Han can be a productive means of confronting trauma as the Korean diaspora grows and encounters new kinds of challenges. In this presentation, I haven't given any really long quotes, but since Lee is such a great stylist, I wanted to let her sing a little bit. So here's a passage that I think captures the essence of her view on Han. It's also the source of the translation that I proposed at the beginning of this presentation. So this is Jane speaking in first person. In our family, we impose our will on one another, generation after generation, with no one ever getting what they want, as if we live a legacy of melancholy, a public historical trauma made private and intimate. It pulls us apart, but we always come back, braided together in our need. In this quote, we can feel the emotional investment that Lee has in her writing, but we can also witness the provocative academic position that Lee has taken on the function of Han. Although our assumption might be that Han is divisive and painful, it's also a form of intimacy that draws together those who've shared in suffering, sort of like penguins huddling from the cold. Here's some penguins. So when working with Han, I think by force of habit, analysts sometimes tend to defer to deductive reading and simply just kind of read in a way that reinforces the scholarly consensus. But the inductive reading that I've attempted seeks to affirm the text's authenticity first and the theory's integrity second. So if it can affirm the theory too, that's great. But at the end of the day, I think Han theory is just a discursive construct that scholars have created in order to speak abstractly about what's really a range of affective phenomena. So, to be responsible scholars, when we're dealing with these kinds of culturally specific emotional concepts, then if we think of the artwork or the text as like a melody, we should be playing the accompaniment rather than conducting. What I hope my paper contributes to the scholarship then is not an essentialized understanding of Han. Rather, it's a methodological framework that can help us understand Han and assert its complexity in highly local contexts. So to sum up, I just want to go through my title once more in forwards order. So this study glimpsed 4 characteristics of Han in 3 short stories. My results don't offer a final definition or the final word on what Han is. Instead, they're observations of Han in action and a unique and, I think, significant context, Lisa Lee's fiction. In this project, I've tried to put the Jane Kim stories in the foreground. They are incisive, heartfelt, and more than worthy of our attention. Thank you.